Welcome back, friends. My name is John Flug. I'm the pastor and teaching elder here at First Presbyterian Church, and this is James Spurgeon. He is the elder of the church who has been given charge over Christian education. And we have, if you've been following along, we've been going through the Old Testament, book by book. We've just taken a look at each one of them, and periodically we'll finish a genre of books and give a little intro to the next genre, and that's precisely what we're doing today. We're giving an introduction to the genre of Old Testament books called Poetry and Wisdom, the Poetry and Wisdom books. And so as we begin today, I'll ask you this, James. What are the books that make up this genre? What are the Poetry and Wisdom books of the Old Testament?
Well, traditionally they are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And then just because we can, we've thrown in Lamentations, even though it's traditionally in the major prophets, because it comes right after Jeremiah. It's a long poem, and so I thought, well, we should probably just discuss it along with the Poetry and Wisdom books.
Okay, I think that's a good idea, and you're right. There's no one that can stop us. So as we're entering into this, there's an interesting question that comes up, and it is, we've been going through the historical books where we're seeing the story of God and seeing the story of God's people. Why switch? I mean, why wouldn't it just be sufficient to tell story about God? Why do we need poetry and wisdom literature here?
Well, there are lots of different people. We're all different. We all are unique, and God has been creating unique people for thousands of years, and so you can imagine that people in the Old Testament were unique. David was a very passionate person. Solomon was a unique person, and God has in his book that He's given us different genres. Some people are more of an artistic type person, and this particular genre might appeal more to them, might speak more to them, whereas some people are more analytical and they want to look at the historical books. And there's something in the Bible for everyone, right, if you want to look at it that way.
There's also a sense in which, story certainly conveys truth, but poetry conveys truth in a way that story just can't do.
Yes, absolutely. There are things that in these books that just speak to the heart and give insight into what's going on in Israel, into things that you can't just get from the narrative.
Okay. As we are thinking, these were obviously written in time, by people in time. Were they concentrated in a certain time in Israel's history, or are they spread out? Can you give us an idea about when these books were generally written?
Well, Job, the first one, is quite possibly the oldest book we have in the Bible. And some ancient rabbinic sources even attributed to Moses. There's also a possibility that Job was written sometime during the time of Solomon. We don't know for sure, but it covers or harkens back to a period of time before Israel, during the patriarchs. So in that sense, if you wanted to put Job as an historical figure, you would place him during the time of Abraham. But then you get to Psalms, and the Psalms, where many of them were attributed to David, some to Moses. These are the songs and prayers of the people of God that they used in temple worship. Proverbs, most of them, not all of them, are attributed to Solomon. Ecclesiastes is written at least in if this is a word, John, Solomonic tradition, in the tradition of Solomon. And so I guess in that sense, Lamentations would be the last of these, since it was attributed to Jeremiah as a part of his prophecy, and he comes toward the end of national Israel.
So there is a bit of a spread, but it does seem to be concentrated really in
David-Solomon time period, the sort of the highlight,
which makes sense, because that was the heyday of Israel, right? I mean, that was the golden age, and so we would expect poetry and wisdom to come from there.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. What about for you, James? Do you have, out of the books that we've listed, do you have a standout or a favorite in the Poetry and Wisdom books?
I don't know that I have a favorite. There are parts that I like from each of them. I found when I was younger, I really enjoyed the first couple chapters of Job, and then it was just mind-blowingly boring to me. I was like, what? There's no more action? How many more chapters are there? But now that I'm older and I look at it, I find it very interesting to see the thinking of the people and the different characters that are there, and the ideas that they express, and they're not as they're speaking with Job, and Job responds to each other, and they're partially right, but they're partially wrong, and Job is partially right and he's partially wrong, and there's just a lot of meat there that appeals to me now that I'm older. And of course the Psalms are so rich. Especially in my job as a hospice chaplain, I find myself in the Psalms all the time, reading the Psalms to people, and the Psalms are so memorable. Proverbs I read a lot when I was younger, and there's much of the Proverbs that's stuck in my head, and hopefully that's a good thing. So I don't guess I have a favorite.
So basically, you're not going to pick one. Huh?
I'm not going to pick one, and I can say I know which one you're going to pick, and there's wonderful things about that one also.
Yeah.
But which one is your favorite?
Well, I would pick, and I think you'd know that I would pick Ecclesiastes. I took a class on it in seminary, and Ecclesiastes just appeals to me because it's just raw and honest about, here's a guy in Solomon who had, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this when we get to the book, but he's got everything. He's got all the money he could want, he's got all the women he could want, he's got all the power he could want, he's got everything. And he says, I still can't enjoy it. You have everything in the world and you can't enjoy it. And so it just presses us forward to keep looking for that. What is it about life that we can enjoy? And I think that speaks to a deep question that's ingrained in all of us.
It does. Ecclesiastes is very popular in our popular culture. It appeals to a lot of people who don't even really have much of a religious faith. It just kind of speaks to people.
Right. Okay. As we think about how these books have been used, you mentioned it, how it's popped up in songs. How through the history of God's people have they used these poetry and wisdom books? Has it been used in the church? Has it been used by the people of God?
Well, Job is a book that has been studied and thought about, and plays have been written about, going way, way back. It's been just a book. Even non-Christian people have looked at the book of Job, and there's just so much depth there. The Psalms were used by the people of God, as already mentioned, in their worship. These are the prayers. These are the songs, the hymns of the people. And so for instance, there are the songs of ascent. As they would travel up to Jerusalem for a feast, they would sing these particular songs. And there were certain psalms that were sung at certain times of worship. This is the worship of the people. If you want to know what the worship was like in the Old Covenant, then you read the Psalms, and here it is. Here's the heart of worship. Here's the longing for God, and going to God in times of despair, and we see the faith there, and going to God in times of joy, and the praise that just erupts, and we see mentions of the musical instruments. And as time goes by, there's a time period in the church, in the Reformation, in the German Reformation. Of course, Martin Luther famously wrote many hymns that they sung, but in the Swiss Reformation, from which our English Reformed tradition comes, they limited themselves to the Psalms. They said, God inspired a hymn book, and we'll sing from that and no other. And so they wrote what were called the Psalters, where they would take these Psalms and they would put them to sort of a rhyme and meter that could be sung to a tune. And some of the earliest books that were actually published in North America were psalters for the churches in North America.
And in fact, I believe to this day that the Orthodox Presbyterian Church sings from psalters.
Yes, still sings from the psalters. In fact, we sing the doxology, praise God, from whom all blessings flow. I've heard that called the Old 100.
The old 100.
And I've looked at Psalm 100 and scratched my head and say, that really comes from Psalm 100? But there you go. The Psalms were used in the Christian churches to sing to God. And some of our hymns that we sing are right out of the Psalms.
Right.
And of course, Proverbs has always been a book from which children were taught practical wisdom for everyday living.
It's a really practical book, isn't it?
Very practical book. And it's funny, if you could picture Proverbs as a guy sitting at a table and having a discussion with some people about how you should live your life. And then here in comes Ecclesiastes, and he sits down and he looks at Proverbs and says, well, you say this, but I say this. And Ecclesiastes becomes almost like he's the counter-argument to Proverbs.
Well, and what's interesting is that they're both attributed to the same person, basically.
Right, yes.
One is Solomon in his younger years, and one's in his later years.
Yes, and so it's very interesting in the song. I remember the Song of Solomon has some very explicit references to marital affection.
Boy, if you know what you're reading, it's an X-rated book.
If you understand what you're reading, you go like, wow. I remember when I was 13 or 14 years old and reading through the Bible, and I came to Song of Solomon, I was like, what? Are you kidding me?
This is in here?
Looking around to see if anybody saw that I was reading it. But there it is in Song of Solomon.
Yeah.
And then Lamentations, of course, is just, as the title suggests, it's just a very, very sad poem written about the fall of Jerusalem and the failure of God's people. And these are books that have spoken to the hearts of God's people over the centuries.
Okay. So it's what does the Christian then take away from these books, these poetry and wisdom books? As we're reading it as Christians, what can we carry away with us?
I think our faith is a faith that appeals to both the mind and the heart. We see our faith being a very intellectually stimulating thing, far from the caricature that you hear from the unbelieving world. Our faith has been struggling with the deep questions of life since Job. And Job, quite possibly the oldest book in the Bible, deals with those questions in deeper ways than anybody in our culture dares to deal with those things. And it appeals to the mind. It appeals to practical living, these books do, and also to the emotions that are involved in our worship. Across the Christian spectrum, we see churches that are almost totally emotional. They are accused, the caricature is that they are totally emotional and that there's no mind involved. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have churches that are sort of the Mensa of Christianity, that they're just totally intellectually stimulating, and going to church is like hearing a seminary lecture. And there's no emotion involved.
Well, Presbyterians have probably traditionally, we fall more on the intellectual side. So this would, I think as we read through these books, and it's a good challenge for us to engage with our hearts.
Right.
And engage God.
God made us emotional and thinking creatures, and we are to worship the Lord our God with all our heart, and with all our mind, and with all our strength. And so we see that embodied in the Psalms. The Psalms are so passionate, and yet they're also, he asks very deep questions of God in the Psalms. And we see this worship take place from across the emotional spectrum.
Right. Okay. What I'd like to do here as we finish, I always ask where do we see Jesus in these. I just want to go through the books and just real quickly, because there's a ton of places we see it in each of these books. But just real quickly, give us a highlight of each one about where we can find Jesus in each one of the books. Can you do that?
Well, I think in Job, the questions that they're asking, and they don't come to a solid conclusion. God comes in at the end and says,